We are here to talk about the future of emissions measurement in cities, or as some of us like to put it, city climate intelligence. And I want to start by thanking the Grantham Environmental Trust, which has made possible the work of many of the organizations that are listed on this opening slide. Before talking about the future of GHG measurement, I want to very, very quickly paint a picture of the current state of GHG measurement in cities. Our colleague Kevin Gurney of the Hestia Project likes to make an analogy with weather reporting. So imagine a situation where every city has to have its own weather service or has to hire an expensive consultant every time it wants a weather report. Then imagine that you can't get that weather forecast for tomorrow or even the weather report for today. You can only get ones from the past. Then imagine that those weather reports are only produced once every few years. That's obviously not the situation where we're in with weather, but it is the situation in some ways that we're in with climate data. The average city greenhouse gas inventory is about 7 years old. They cost nearly $14,000 to produce on average, and those costs can go up to $60,000. So most cities, especially smaller cities, don't have any data at all. You often only get estimates at the aggregate city level, so they're not particularly helpful in targeting street and neighborhood level action, which is what city climate action quite often is about. So here we are, facing down an existential threat to our planet, with cities deeply, deeply committed to doing their part, and we're stuck with this very, very analog, very expensive, and not very robust system. That's kind of a bleak picture, but it's also why I'm really, really happy to introduce our panelists, each of whom is doing some really impressive work to address the problem. Starting with Antoine Gillot of Climate Chance, where Antoine is coordinator of the Global Observatory on Non-State Climate Action. Antoine is an expert on climate and environmental policy at all levels of government. He's published more than 15 reports on climate change mitigation, adaptation, climate finance. Antoine's observatory at Climate Chance analyzes global trends on climate action by subnational actors. That includes local and regional governments, businesses, civil society. He's going to give us an overview of the emissions data challenge for cities today. Next, Fouzi Ben Khalifa. Fouzi is the CEO and founder of Next, which is developing some incredible AI-powered information services related to climate and the energy transition to cities. Directed at cities, businesses, and investors. Fouzi helped author some of the earliest city-specific climate actions in the world more than 2 decades ago. He's one of the most brilliant climate scientists I know. I learn something new from him every single time we talk. Next is a key member of our City Climate Intelligence Initiative, which Fouzi will be talking more about in a few minutes. Then we have Yann Françoise. Yann is head of the climate department at the City of Paris. Since 2004, Yann has led Paris's climate action strategies. That's included calculating and developing the city's carbon footprint, its carbon budget, its vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy, its sustainable energy action plan, its circular economy roadmaps. So truly, Yann is a climate polymath who's doing it all in a city that's doing some incredibly ambitious and impressive things on climate. And then finally, Ross McQuinney. Ross is a senior advisor in the Mayor's Office of Sustainability in New York City. Local Law 97, a truly landmark climate policy which is driving down emissions in large buildings, is something that Ross has been very, very deeply involved in and was a key architect of. He also manages the city's research and data science efforts, including its greenhouse gas inventory. And Yann and Ross are going to provide perspective from 2 of the greatest and 2 of the most climate-forward cities in the world. So for everyone who's watching and listening in, please put your comments and questions in the Zoom chat. We're going to save some time to address them. We're also going to poll you a couple of times over the course of this webinar and share those results more or less instantaneously. So please respond to those questions when they pop up. With that, let me turn it over to Antoine.
Thank you, Rushad. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. So thank you so much to the RMI for inviting me. I'm really honored to be part to such a great panel. And let me first maybe introduce you climate change just quickly so that you understand where I am talking from somehow. Climate change is a Paris-based international scale association which works on building what we call a favorable environment for non-state actors to drive their climate action in the best perspectives. It means that we are gathering local governments, but also businesses, NGOs, civil society movements around three pillars: the portal of action, which is our website for facilitated access to climate-related information, including a cartography of the best practices around the world in terms of mitigation and adaptation to climate change. We have also a global observatory of non-state climate action that I coordinate, which the aim is to tell the story behind the figures somehow, starting from the evolution of GHG emissions and then going down to the public policies led by those non-state actors. We publish every year a global synthesis report on climate action by sector during the COP, and we have released a couple of weeks ago a global synthesis report on local climate action, i.e. from the local government's perspective. And then we have the organization of federative events dedicated to the gathering the climate community at international scale, but also at African and European scale. We were in Nantes a couple of weeks ago for a European level summit, which aims to propose recommendations to the EU Commission for the Fit for 55 package. We also have a dedicated African spaces, which are our African summit. If you can switch to the next slide, just to show you how it looks like when we gather together in real spaces. Back in 2019, it was in Accra, Ghana. So it's very good moments that we're having there, including practical and concrete workshop to work on issues such as the emission measurements and reporting issues. And just to end quickly the presentation of climate change, I'd like to say also that we are a network of many actors. Next, please. Partners, financial partners, including from Europe, France, and the international level. So all these people are working with us, and we would like to thank you. It's thanks to them that we are here today. So first and foremost, to answer the question and just meet the issue that we have today. If we can switch to the next slide. The global state of emission reporting that we have made during our global synthesis report a couple of weeks ago is basically based on the latest data that are provided by the main networks and cooperative initiatives at global level for local and governments. The main one is the Global Covenant of Mayors, which gathers now 740 signatories across the world. You can see on the map on the right side that most of them now are currently in Europe. This is because the EU Covenant of Mayors is at the origin of the Global Covenant of Mayors. This is now covering nearly 13% of the world population, and the Global Covenant of Mayors is able to assess that all the commitments formulated by these cities have a mitigation potential of 1.9 gigaton CO2 equivalent per year by 2030. It is interesting to take a look at these networks because they are aggregating the commitments from the cities, and it is much harder to assess the progress of the countless cities that are making up the 193 state signatories of the Paris Agreement than the state themselves. So this is very important to have these networks for us to have a global picture and to understand what is their assets and their difficulties, the difficulties they met to measure their progress and to report action. So the Global Covenant of Mayors has provided back in 2018 during the Global Climate Action Summit that was organized in San Francisco, a common reporting framework which aims to provide guidelines for the two main reporting platforms in the world for local government, the CDP CLAY Unified Reporting System and the EU Covenant of Mayors, My Covenant. Next, please. Right now, if you take a look at the European Covenant of Mayors signatories, it is very, very interesting and I'd say insightful because this is the most advanced space of collaboration for cities right now in the world. And they have now every year an assessment study that is driven by the Joint Research Center of the EU Commission that is trying to assess and analyze the progress that the cities have made regarding their commitments to engage a climate action plan for mitigation and adaptation, and also to report their progress through monitoring emission inventories. So right now, according to the latest assessment, we have about 1,643 cities with at least one monitoring emission inventory regarding their 2020 targets. In average, they have reduced their emissions by 19.5% between their baseline emission inventory and their monitoring emission inventory. They are mostly aligned with their objective, as you can see, with the 40% overshot their 2020 target and 82 are very close to their target. Yet there remain one very hard and important issue, which is the timing gap between emission inventories and decision making. As you said, Rushad, there is a 7-year time lap between the latest inventory and today when we do this assessment. Next, please. The CDP ICLEI Unified Reporting System is right now also considering some change in accounting methodology and data access, as you can see in the drivers of mitigation. There is also a huge, many different methodologies that are being used in the reporting systems. So this is also creating some sorts of difficulties to aggregate the results. Next, please. If we take a look to the African situation specifically, Africa is very interesting because it is only accounting for 4% of the global fossil fuel emissions in 2017. It has a huge growth rate in emissions over the last years, but also different evolution patterns according to the countries that we are looking to. Next, please. So this is a continent that is facing a lot of challenges, including urban sprawling and a lot of rising fossil fuels combustion from different activities. So many of these cities have committed to the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is generating a groundswell of commitments for climate action. But right now, the tracking and the monitoring of the results is still very difficult, as you mentioned, with the classical statistical inventory system, especially because there is a lot of informal activities, there is a lot of urban sprawling. So spaces is changing a lot as the frontiers of the cities is changing a lot. And there is also very much difficulties about the governance of the data. Data basically is power. And in Africa, many cities do not have elected mayors. They have appointed mayors from the national government. So if you have the power to drive your public policies independently from the national governments, you can meet difficulties and opposition of political nature. And last slide, please. I would just like to summarize all I've said very quickly here in 3 points. We have 3 challenges to robust climate data management right now across the world, be it in Europe, in the world, or even in Africa. This is the collection, which is about issues of governance frameworks, measurement tools, and poor reporting system. As we said, the latest inventories are very old in most of the cities across the world and even in Europe. We have also a challenge of analysis. It is a matter of skills at national and local civil servant level, the existence of specific analysis frameworks to each countries and carbon-based to understand how you can multiply your proxy data into carbon accounting, and then the use of data, which is a matter of the tools for decision-making by the actors. How do you connect the collection of data to the policy making in the end at the local level? Thank you, Rashad.
Thank you, Antoine. Ross, I'm actually going to direct a question to you coming off Jan's presentation. And I'm going to play the skeptic here for a minute. My question is basically, to what extent is poor emissions data a major impediment to, or a major driver of city climate action? I'm thinking of the page that Antoine presented on CDP ICLEI data, showing that emissions reporting is actually declining, but mitigation action is actually gathering steam. So don't all cities fundamentally know that they need to decarbonize buildings, transportation, power systems? And don't we also, at a basic level, know how to do these things? Doesn't, for example, every single city need to implement building performance standards like your local law 97? Aren't the real challenges things like politics, money, limited capacity? So help me with perhaps the New York City perspective on the importance of more robust climate or emissions data.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think I think poor data is a major impediment for sure. And I feel like I'm saying that as someone who works in a city that has very good data in some spaces that we work in. And then I also see some significant gaps. And so that makes me, I think, fairly sensitive to understand how far we can go when data is available. And then I look at other sectors where there should be opportunities, but we just don't know enough about them to really map those opportunities. So, you know, I mean, I have to agree, of course, politics and money and capacity are very important, but it's my experience that you need emissions data to kind of inform and direct leadership on those points to get at that power and those resources. You know, maybe if we had a big, powerful climate lobby, we wouldn't need to do that, but I don't think we're quite there. So to say the other thing is we've established really a fact base here in the city that has persisted through 3 mayoral administrations already. And we're just bringing on a new mayor. And I see that we're referring back to that fact base repeatedly. You know, he comes from a background of law enforcement, and you know, emissions isn't necessarily his background, so we have to help bring him and his team up to speed. And having that inventory and really 15 or more years, 17 years of data is a really strong resource to help do that. It's also really important because we do have folks with a lot of power and resources and money that make many assertions, and having that fact base to either confirm or refute those assertions is really critical. I'd say also, you know, you can't just take one inventory from one city and say that's going to be the map for all cities. You know, in New York, buildings are 2/3 of our citywide emissions. And then San Francisco, transportation is the largest source of their emissions. So if you were trying to take the New York inventory and map it to San Francisco, it really wouldn't make very much sense. I'd say also, you know, you kind of do have to go past the inventory. We have really strong buildings data, and that's allowed us to understand that addressing the 5% of buildings, which are our largest, and then segmenting those, let's get into, well, actually it's multifamily and the heating and hot water in multifamily. So you can drill down to the specific issues that you need to build policy around. If you don't have the data, you really just can't get to those issues.
Thanks, Russ. Incredible, a ton of richness in your answer, and the point that you make about both the I guess transferability of insights from one city to another, and how actionable you can in fact get with what's available to us right now is certainly pretty compelling to me. I'm going to move us along. Fuzi is going to talk about the City Climate Intelligence Initiative next. So Fuzi, why don't you take it away from here?
Thank you, Rushad. So maybe I want to answer to the concern raised by Antoine and by Ross. The situation is far from being explained by the scarcity of urban data. In fact, it's really and strictly the opposite. We all know that there is an uncontrolled profusion of data generated in cities. But can you next? Yeah. So it's better like this. There's a profusion of data generated in cities that they are mainly devoted to boosting our consumption, and so in fact generate carbon emissions. So that's the big paradox. Among this myriad of new data sources, we can find, for example, GPS data from vehicles, connected energy meters, satellite imageries. They are precious resources for knowing the metabolism of the city. A recent study from International Energy Agency shows that cities are using, at best, 10% of this urban big data. The good news I want to share with you is that data science and artificial intelligence can now structure and enrich these unexplored real-time and located data continent. That's a very the major leap these past years. Next. So let me introduce you the CCI, the City Climate Intelligence Initiative. Our raison d'être is to make this untapped climate intelligence accessible to all and at a double scale. First scale, from pioneering cities such as Paris, LA, New York, and others, to more recently committed ones, not only focusing on the most advanced. Second, both in North and South countries, we know that the information gap is not the same level, but is the same problem, and we have to mobilize this information system towards these two kind of situation. And third point, the two level I've seen also, it's also how to address the question at the metro level, knowing the trends and knowing what happened on over the cities, but also how can we reach also the building and the street level. So next slide. Oh, thank you. So we believe that this, yes. Yes, so we believe that the mobilization of this emerging data should be, a public good. And so what we see here is that there is, many existing data set at city level. Now, before it, jump to the, yes, thank you. So as a public good here. And so what we see is that the global technology we're relying on is at the start very similar to the GHG protocol, in fact, except that we source our data at a finer resolution, at the largest geographical scale. That's the main difference. But beyond that, we have revisited all the urban emission sectors by identifying the data sources at the finest scale, polygons for buildings, lines for transport, and point sources asset level for industry and energy production. Remote sensing data allows both high frequency temporalization and located spatial data that can fill the gap in the city data set. So AI is really a major help to calibrate, detect patterns, and process these massive data sets. Next, thank you. And so when it comes to this situation, we have in mind that the political, the economic, and social value of CO2 emission data makes it, in a way, public interest. It must be freely available to all. The work done by RMI with a large panel of American cities and by Next with European cities within the AI for City program was the occasion to explore with targeted users what is the transformative capacity of such high resolution CO2 emission data in near real time. Our intuition was that the emission inventory should go beyond reporting. The entire life cycle of public decision making could be fed by such a system. This was what was very considered as a priority by the city panel. First, we have to consider that it will help to change the narrative and the pace of dialogue with CBOs and citizens. But don't be naive. This will not change most of the individual behavior to have this information, but it will directly contribute, have an impact for higher citizen buy-in in bolder climate decision from the city. The second point is that these data streams are the opportunity to exactly mainstream the city planning tool chain with more actionable GHG information. And finally, as an information system, so this paved the way for shared view between cities and companies. They can jointly identify the best cooperation opportunities. And we think that time has come to make cities the next neutrality contribution playground for businesses and climate finance players. Next. So let's look here what is in concrete manner the city climate intelligence. It's a two-pronged data delivery. At this stage, we consider this as two separate work streams, but there is some growing connection. Tier 1, which is for the city and the metro scale, is covering today 5 continents. We are tracking trends and offer comparable emission data. It will also, we think, that educate on short-term prediction milestones. For this, we build on carbon monitor cities and Vulcan. At tier 3 level and tier 2 also, so tier 2 is district and tier 3 building and street level, the information system aims to support efficient day-to-day climate action operation. It covers all the urban activities, but with their specific climate decision metrics. We were more than lucky to start this with Los Angeles and Paris to test our algorithm and data sourcing platform. And to be clear, the richness of their climate policies is a source of inspiration for future users. Next. The very first prototype of this tier 1 product is today visible at cities.carbonmonitor.org with the first selection of 47 cities over the 5 continents. Here, the most important advance is that the creation of a continuous time series and comparable data set. We can see the seasonality of GHG emission, and it's a new dimension for awareness and planning. As you can see, no need to wait years and years to know that it was back to normal in Delhi after the big 2020 drop due to the COVID-19 lockdowns. So next. And what I would like to say is about this tier 3 level. The purpose of this is to create a common language between all the users, all the developers of such a solution. We have to align our vocabulary, and so this tier 3 is really now more focusing on producing actionable information. So we have, with the same granularity, Los Angeles and Paris, and so we developed an harmonized data processing methodology. Here at a glance, 2 use cases concerning the housing sector. In the Paris metropolitan area, we have identified clusters of low-hanging fruits. It means that with the same amount of public subsidies, the impact of this building block we're targeting can be 2 or 3 times higher than the average operation. And on the other side, the Los Angeles example is highlighting here the very high variability of impact that a solar panel program for low-income household can have. This can guide environmental justice action by the city and CBOs. We will share more use cases this Friday during our one-day hybrid workshop with the city of LA and local stakeholders. And my last word will go to the next slide. And so my final word goes to the very first believer of such initiative, Kevin Tidwell from Grantham Foundation. And maybe I have to consider that this will not happen without the grid architect, Phil DeCola from IGIS WMO. I want to pinpoint what was the real added value from the Carbon Monitor team and express that Philip CS, Zulu, Stephen Davis, and Dahu have been, playing a full collaboration. And a special thank, a very big thanks as a partner to Professor Gurney, his team, Geoffrey and Paolo Das, my team also, Nicolas, Mark, Solin, and the AI for Cities team. And last but not least, Rushad, Emma, Zach, and Debbie, thanks for supporting this vision, but we know we are at the start. So thank you.
Thank you, Fuzi. Yeah, definitely at the start, but hopefully we'll also be making pretty rapid and substantive progress over the coming weeks and months. Antoine, I'm going to come back to you. And having seen now with Fuzi's presentation what we're working on, I'd love your view on how helpful you think a product like this can be. And I'm in particular interested in in say the African city perspective. You talked about this groundswell of climate commitment in Africa, but also the paucity of data for these cities. So would something like the base product that Fuzi described with its 10 square kilometer sort of resolution really be helpful in advancing the climate agenda in cities like that? Or do you think to be truly useful, every single city needs the gold-plated version that's being developed for Paris and LA?
Yes, Rashad, thank you. Obviously, situations are very different from African cities to such well-organized cities as Los Angeles is, or Paris, which is based on a very old historic center. So each city is specific. Although, as Fuzi said, his technology is providing a common language, a universal language, to have a common appreciation of the GHG emissions trends that you can have at the city level or neighborhood level or a building level within one urban space. The specific situation in Africa is that you have urban sprawling cities, which are very, very hard to control, even for the local authorities. It's very, very hard to identify the borders and the frontiers of a street, of a neighborhood. There is a lot of informal buildings. So having atmospheric measurement, being with ground sensors or being with satellite technologies or using proxy data sources such as GPS sources is really helping to have this, above ground vision that you can so you can monitor how is such a fast moving space driving its emissions upwards or downwards. And this is not only specific to African cities, actually, as we saw, even in Europe, where there is a huge and long tradition of emission monitoring over the last 20 years, we are still basing our assessment in 2022 on 2014 inventories, which means that this is the time of a mayor mandate in France, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years. This is so important that now policymakers need to have right on time, accurate data so that they can target their initiatives and policy making where the priority is. I would just like to quote quickly Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the General Assembly of the UN, who said during COP26 that we need action to be verified and we need to bridge the deep and real credibility gap. This is also about credibility, about accountability towards the citizens and towards the international community as part of the Paris Agreement. Without that, we won't be able to make it to the global stocktake. We have 2 years to go until the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement to have the first assessment of the progress we've made. It is obviously much more harder, as I say, to monitor the emissions of the countless local governments that compose the states who signed the Paris Agreements. It is now very necessary that we step up the technologies and the methodologies that we have to monitor these emissions.
Thank you, Antoine. I really like the language that you used around there being a need for common vocabulary with respect to this stuff. And I'm also really glad you pointed to the challenge of sprawl, which, to your point, is certainly not confined to African cities. There was a study that we were reading recently that talked about sampling, I think, about 100 cities across the world, that talked about how urban land areas are expanding 67% faster than urban populations. So we know that that's a critical challenge, and one that, as you described it, this overhead monitoring system could help keep track of, much better keep track of in real time. Jan, I'm going to turn it to you now for the view from Paris.
Thank you, Rashad, for the opportunity. Thank you, Ermai, for the invitation. Can we go to next slide, maybe? Maybe you have heard City of Paris, as you was said, has a now long experience to try to tackle climate change issues by mitigating and adapting solution for the City of Paris. The first GHG emission balance for the City of Paris has been made around 2005 with the base year 2004. And after that, the first climate action plan has been adopted in 2007 to try to decrease by 25% GHG emissions by 2020. So now a long experience about different GHG emission audit. But after COP21, Mayor Hidalgo asked to the team and to all the citizens and stakeholders, what does it mean if we want to achieve the Paris Agreement? And so what does it mean to become a fairer, resilient, more inclusive, and carbon neutral cities? And it was at this period, next slide please, on 2016. Now currently, maybe everybody talk about carbon neutrality or maybe climate neutrality. What is the same definition or not? But at this stage, there is no common definitions when you talk about different cities among the big network, UKE, C40, CNCA. You have different meaning here. And we have to thank one wonderful woman in New York, and Ross say hello to Leah when you will meet her, because Leah Caron decided to lead a global work with different cities like Paris, but also LA, Durban, and different cities, and London, maybe if I will well remember, and Buenos Aires, to try to design a carbon neutrality framework. What does it mean? How manage residual emission? Because as it was said before by Antoine, there is so many protocol definitions that it can be useful sometimes to share the same concept. So you can download this wonderful framework. So next slide, please. But what does it mean, carbon neutrality for city of Paris? As it was said, we can count what we want. It depends also according to your national regulation, for us, European regulations. And if you have a look to this Paris carbon footprint, you can see that the blue one is the local emissions, 5.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent. So we take account all the GHG emissions from GH4, N2O, CFC, FCFC, and so on. But it represents only a quarter of the carbon footprint of city of Paris. So mainly the main part of the emission are produced outside the city. Not so far sometimes for the commuter transportation, for example, or for the food consumed by the citizen in Paris, because we have no agriculture fields within Paris boundaries, but sometimes far away. For example, I take the flight to come to LA for this workshop. So we take account the flight for the passengers and the good delivered to Paris in our carbon footprint. Thanks to that, we have a steady pictures that have been followed for now 15 years, a very steady method with steady data provider, but I can't produce it every year. It's impossible, and I produce it now quite every for 3 years and 2 years for the local emissions. So next slide, please. But as you know, we have to become carbon neutral everywhere, and we have to foster. Is apparently everybody said now it's a decade of fostering climate action. It's the case of also for City of Paris. We have for the next 10 years, 8 years now, to do the same jobs that 15 years before. But we are lucky, we have experience, but how to deal with that? And how to deal for our city managers, decision makers, stakeholders, because it's not only the responsibility of the mayor to manage the carbon neutrality of a city. It depends on everyone, citizens, stakeholders, how to involve everyone if we want to foster and not to only depend on a picture every 3 or 4 years. So next slide, please. Is why this group and all that was presented before can be very, very useful for everyone to make access to the data, but also to make access to tools to analyze the data. It's not only to gather the data, there is so many data to interpret. To be confident about that is very, very important to make people aware about the quality of the data and to be confident about the quality of the data. Because if you compare different figures of GHG emission report by different cities, it depends on the method. In one method, you can publish 1 million tons, in the other method, 22 million tons. So it's very, very difficult for people and citizens to understand why. But one example, when we need accurate data and maybe closer data in the frequency, one of the opportunities to City of Paris is to have a district heating network, and which is for the moment the low carbon energy delivered in Paris for heating. But we want to develop it more and more. And of course, maybe not to have a very important development of the infrastructure because it costs a lot. But thanks to the new data, we discovered that finally, with no needs to develop new pipes, we can connect 500,000 new flats units just close to our current networks. We can double the people connected to the network only by that. And so we can follow now, month by month, not maybe day by day, it's not useful, what progress we done. And next slide, we can show other examples when it can be useful to have high frequency and accurate data. It's not useful for everything. We have to take care of that. I a little bit disagree with Kevin Gurney about that. Of course, we need maybe a weather forecast for adaptation every day and maybe 3 days before to anticipate and to prevent from people of large crises like heat waves and so on. But for GHG emissions, it depends on what you talk. When you talk about retrofitting of the buildings or huge infrastructure, you don't need real-time data. But if you want to assess the changement of the behavior, you need real-time data. It's the case currently. We live, unfortunately, with a dramatic war in Ukraine, energy crisis. But we have seen that people, by solidarity, they want to decrease our Russians' gas dependency, and they want to decrease by 1 degree or 2 degrees their heat system. How to assess? To say, hey, you do indeed a good job. The same about mobility policy. Sometimes some decisions about development sustainable policy have a very high level bad social acceptability by citizens. And if you express more and more transparent data every day about the consequences, positive or negative, you can deal with the people. And the last one that's the more priority for me is have to social inclusion. After COVID-19 and now energy crisis, we have more and more people touched by energy poverty. And if we want to follow them to prevent the crisis and to help them, we need accurate data about that. And this new tool can be very, very useful. Is one of my message. And the other message is to give all these tools, all the data from the satellite, from the sensor, open from everyone, for any colleagues, from the south, from the north. We need that to help people to understand and to accelerate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I had a couple of questions teed up, but I really like the audience questions that are coming in, so I'm actually going to go with them. Martin Gibbons asks, do we think more comprehensive data will inspire political leaders or threaten them? And I suppose, the answer to that is, well, it depends on what data and maybe more importantly, what political leader. But in our work, we've discussed this tension or this duality between data used as a tool for management decision-making versus data used as a way to force accountability. And I'm going to maybe direct this question to you, Ross. How would you respond to Martin's question and that tension between using it as a tool to guide decisions versus hold city leadership or political leadership to account?
Sorry, the question about would it threaten leaders?
Yeah. Would it inspire or would it threaten the leadership of any given city?
Yeah, I think your first point was a good one, which is it really depends on the leader. But I guess my experience is that leaders aren't making decisions in vacuums. That particularly here in New York and maybe other places as well, we have a really strong set of stakeholders, advocates, particularly in the building space, folks who are really smart on the issues and they're incredibly vocal. If the mayor maybe isn't responding a certain way, they will that they want to see a response, they will make that point clear. So I think it's useful to have this information out there, regardless of how any one particular politician responds. The more transparent it is, I think the better the reaction and the more resources that will come to kind of understand that data and advocate on its behalf, really.
Thanks, Ross. I'm going to mash together a couple of questions from Ghislaine Steensma and Laura Tugwell. And apologies if I mispronounce any of these names. I'm going to do my best. So Laura's question, Fuzi, this is to you, I think, primarily. Can we utilize new technology, for example, trace, in this case, tracking real-time carbon emissions for this work? And relatedly, the question from Ghislaine, what is actually measured using remote sensing data, and how far can emissions data be extracted with reasonable levels of certainty? How much ground truthing is required?
So thank you for this question. I would say concerning Trace or any other data platform, I would say that yes, of course, we need to calibrate and to enrich any local system with over-the-shoulder information system. So Trace is using OCO2 and OCO3 satellite data. They're making a good job about tracking large point sources. So there's some point sources in large point sources in urban areas. So what is done by Trace is really a good example, and we're talking about the Climate Trace initiative, I think. And so concerning the question raised by Ghislaine, what is actually measured from, so remote sensing, in fact, we have several type of data. We have a direct measurement coming from the activity, such as GPS, geolocation coming from mobile phones, and or coming from connected metering system. And so we have direct assessment of the traffic flow, of the energy consumption, of the origin destination, and so it's a good way to calibrate any GHG information system. But the other point is the other kind of remote sensing is satellite and sensors that can be rolled out in cities, or and so there is for this use you need to develop an inversion model. And some cities are doing this kind of job, and they are on the edge of this industry, and so that's a very good solution. But I think that if we want to scale and to cover many cities all over the world, a situation where we rely on ground data coming from usual sources such as GPS and others, and with carbon tracking data coming from satellite, could be a good trade-off.
Thank you, Fuzi. A question that I'm maybe going to direct, well, I'll invite Antoine you to weigh in on this, since you made the point about sprawl, but also Jan, Ross, if you have a perspective, I'd love to hear it. A question from Eric Ross: should we be concerned that focusing on emissions within a city will cause the source of those emissions to move outside of the city, meeting the city's goal, but resulting in little or no real emissions reduction overall? So the question really here is about, where do you draw the system boundary? And when I think about, I'll maybe expand it to think about a situation that we see commonly in US cities, where exclusionary or restrictive housing and zoning policy pushes development of housing from what would have been really low carbon footprint locations within the city to much higher carbon footprint locations in the suburbs and exurbs. So, per Eric's question, if you draw a tight boundary conforming to the municipal boundary, then you might be doing fine. But if you're really thinking about the global impact, you're really not. So would love your thoughts on what, how to draw and how to think about that system boundary question. Maybe Ross first and then Jan.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this does come up, particularly in the case of our building performance standard, Local Law 97. And, some approaches that are discussed are maybe you normalize for a certain type of activity in a building. Certainly, we've set limits within that law that are use specific. So it's trying to set a fair limit, but one that does consider the activity in the building. I'd say, the only other thing really to me is that our goal, as I think, as at least as a city, maybe for all cities, is that we're all trying to lead, and there has been over time some vacuum of leadership at times at the national level. So if cities can set policies and adopt them across the country, we're going to have a much bigger impact than one by itself. So I guess I'm just thinking that, yes, you may displace a bit, but if many cities are taking this approach, perhaps it's a more complete approach.
Yeah, maybe to complete the purpose of Ross is why I shown the slide about the carbon footprint of the city of Paris, because there is no boundaries about GHG emissions from a territory. It's the case, of course, of building, but more for transportation and for consumption base. But about buildings, you talk about residential, but it was a case 30, 40 years before, and will be the case for new cities too. For in Europe, we delocalize industry far away from the heart of the city, but we still use product from the industry. So we can say, oh, we have no more industry GHG emissions within our boundaries, but they are not so far. It's the same case for logistic platform. There is no big logistic platform in the heart of the core of all the cities, but we need them to live. So it's very important to share that and to be solidar with the first around suburbs and of course the countryside, because we can have the same dialogue about industry and agriculture, but it's very hard to have the data. When you talk about consumption base, for example, you don't have the correct GHG emission of your cell phone because you need the data from India or from China and so on, and it's very, very hard to assess. So it's why sometimes we have to accept not to be so precise in our carbon footprint, but to follow some very steady figures to show the trend, but to have in the mind of people that we have some kind of responsibility to share together.
Thank you.
Maybe I can add on this point a few words about the scope, what we measure the city boundaries, and what could be also the impact of this city. If we consider the scope 3, means the impact by the consumption and import of goods and so on. I would say that's how we see the way that the tier 1 carbon monitor cities and the tier 3 product are, it's a dialogue, because we want to cover all the cities with this tier 1 product in order to have a clear signal about, emerging carbon emission growth some cities, and being aware that sometimes where we reduce here, we are increasing outside. And so having both north and south cities and having this similar vocabulary to compare what is done in city A and city B is a way to address this question of being comprehensive.
Thanks, Fuzi. Antoine, I'm going to maybe direct another question from you. This one is from Matthew Rosen. You have this, Antoine, this kind of global view of subnational climate action and how data can help. And Matthew's question is, I would like to understand what data categories have been most useful for decision making from a practical standpoint. So what are some of the sort of trends that you've picked up in your work? If Fuzi and the team are going to focus on, a subset of data that would be most critical with respect to driving decision making, what would that subset look like?
Well, if I may take an example, we drove with climate change a couple of years ago some kind of diagnosis of the transportation system in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ivory Coast. And the idea was to see what are the challenges ahead, to change, to push the proper policies to transform the transportation system towards a low carbon one. A major issue that was raised is how old are the vehicles in the territory, because they are mostly imported from European countries after having been used for many years in Europe, which results in a car fleet at national level, which is very scattered in terms of quality. So it's very hard to understand what is the impact of fossil fuel combustion, for instance, from each unity of car that is driving across the city, especially that you don't have also the proper monitoring structures to push for the data. So this is an example of the proxy data that you can find, which is very interesting on site to understand the specificity of a city, to get finer understanding of how is your territory working, how is it different from others, because you cannot, there is no one size fits all solution. So this is the sort of data that you need to bring up, and that the FTSE solution can be interesting in terms of, you know, erasing these differences and having this above ground view. Great.
Thank you, Antoine. Last question, Fuzi, for you. You've got exactly 1 minute to answer it. What would it take for you and the CCI team to develop the Paris and LA version, or something like it, for, say, 100 cities or 1,000, or thinking massively ambitiously for 10,000?
Oh, in fact, my answer will be very direct. For 10,000 cities next month, it's not possible. And I can ask to Kevin Gurney, to Philippe Sies, and all the team. I'm sure they will have the same answer. So, but what I would say that I see three conditions for scaling up this kind of approach. First, there is technical condition. So I think we fulfill this because we try from the beginning to have a scalable approach. In fact, we source our data at the country level. In fact, we do not consider cities one by one, consider a region. In fact. So it's the same data set for the housing sector, for transport sector, and so if you can do it in Paris, you can do it in Versailles. If you can do it in LA, you can do it also in Oklahoma or other Oklahoma City or other. But that's the feasibility is now that's no problem. But the data sourcing is the main point. The second point is the necessity of use. Do we need such a tier 3 product for every city? It means that the city has needs the capacity of handling this, and so maybe a good trade-off could be a tier 2 approach, not at this building or street level for any city in the world, as you're asking. But I would say maybe it's like tier 2 means district level, and with the support of, for example, international urban development funding agencies, it can be used also in the right manner. And last point, very, very important, we need trustworthiness, we need a standardized framework. Such platforms can be, rolled out if the technology chain and users are well defined and recognized by the third parties. And this is the challenge of standardization. And I would like to say and to thanks NIST and especially James Whetstone. He is currently tackling this challenge of developing such a standard within the ISO community. So yes, it's possible. The budget is not here right now, but we can do it in a proper manner if we address the 3 points.
Thanks, Fuzi. That last point is obviously super important, especially if we are to make this, as you described it, a public good, which I think we all believe really strongly it needs to be and should be. So I'll leave it there with that as a marker, the aspiration to produce something like this for many more cities than we're doing right now. For those of you who've stuck around, thank you very much. Please feel free to continue the conversation with us at this email address. And thanks again for joining. And thanks to each of you, Antoine, Jan, Ross, Fuzi, really, really appreciate the time and the insights.